pottery. The first sort of pottery you get made in the new exclusively here is you have that osteonoid pottery. And you see we use this oid term a lot. Archaeologists, we tend to like to classify things and give them names that mean nothing to nobody else and add an oid to it. So a few years ago we did a project out at Clifton and we found a nice piece of pottery on Flipper Beach, so we decided to call it Flipperoid. It didn't stick though. So, but what we know is that if you expect the Lucayans to come from these people, then you would expect them to have really nice pottery. So this is one of the reasons why Bill and I decided, you know, let's look at everything again. Let's launch a new project. Let's forget everything we know and start over. So we've launched what we call the Bahamas Colonization Project. And the entire purpose of this project is to get an understanding of where the Lucayans came from. So what we know is that some of the islands on the north coast of Cuba were settled almost 5,000 years ago. I mean, you have great examples, and actually the archaeology there looks like the archaeology in the Bahamas. So if this is where people came from into the Bahamas, if you look at that aerial map there, it's not far from those islands to the shallow banks of the Bahamas. So we went, let's say, well, let's look at the closest islands to the Bahamas. Well, we went to Guinchos Key and Key Lobos, hoping to find Lucayan sites, and unfortunately we didn't find anything. But that doesn't mean that Lucayans didn't stop there for a break and then continue on. What we do know, though, is that we've also surveyed the islands of the Gementos Keys, and these are the keys leading the Ragged Island Range. And we find almost on every key Cuban pottery, evidence of early people coming through there. So this looks like this is possibly the passageway into the Bahamas. I don't know why I put the pottery slide up again. But also, a few years ago, we were told about a site in Long Island where a Lucayan skull was found on the beach. So, and you heard what I said earlier, well, we know that they buried their dead in caves. Well, this is the second example of a beach burial in the Bahamas, but this is so much more complicated than the other one we found. So this is the first individual. And if you can see, this person is actually, once again, as a Preacher's Cave person, buried face down. But their hands are above the head, and they actually still have their skull. This is the second individual. Once again, buried face down. This time, hands to the side. Directly under this individual, though, is we find what's known as a bundle burial. And so that means this person was bundled, legs up also, probably wrapped up somehow and buried. What's fascinating is the person on top is an older woman, this is a younger woman, so maybe some sort of grandmother, granddaughter, grandmother, daughter, we don't know. But usually you find that kind of burials elsewhere where you have some sort of genetic relationship. So this is just another example of the face down individual, just a real close-up of what we found there. So, all right, so we just proved something else wrong. We know the Lucayans now buried their dead in beaches also. But what's interesting was, this isn't on the leeward side of the island. This was on the windward side of the island. So now we have to rethink it. Okay, now we know they use both sides of at least Long Island. This is Long Island. So we wanted to see, can we find a site around these burials? Possibly the village, who knows? So we conducted an archaeological survey there. And while we didn't find the village, we actually found a lot of evidence of use in the area. So we found earth ovens where we could see where that they were processing foods. We did a really intensive excavation this year and found all kinds of fish, bones, shell, tools. We did some chemical analysis on some of the tools, and that's where we found manioc, corn. We have scientists looking at the wood to see what kind of wood they were burning. Someone looking at all the fish so we can tell exactly what were these people eating. But one of the things we also did was we decided, well, if we have this site on the windward side, are there other sites on the windward side of the island? So we surveyed from Clarencetown to Dean's Blue Hole, walked the entire coastline, and basically found that that entire area was used by the Lucayans. So now, okay, good, Lucayans lived on both sides of the island. But the interesting thing about this was that this is very thin use. So it was like they used this once and then moved on. So right now our theory was, well, maybe during the winter during the summer they would come onto the windward side of the island because it would be calmer, do some fishing there. But during the winter would probably go to the lee side where it would be calmer, because when we worked there, all 3 times we were there, it was incredibly rough. Couldn't go swimming. Sometimes the waves would come in and splash and hit us, and we were quite far from the beach. So it's pretty rough there. We also did some work in Eleuthera. This is a wet cave in the Hatchet Bay Cave system area. A lot of people who've been to Eleuthera before, and they know about the famous Hatchet Bay Cave. But there's a whole series of caves along that ridge. And one of those caves is just a little crack in the rock. You walk in, and then there's water everywhere. So this is an example I told you where this is the mixed cave. And we were able to excavate at least 10 individuals. We're still processing the bones because unfortunately this site was looted before we went there. So a lot of things were mixed up, but based on the leg bones we found, we know we have at least, I would say, 8 to 10 individuals. So this is something now that we're using to help us, my slides slid there, help us get a better understanding of who these Lucayans were. So some studies that we're doing in the near future, we're going to continue the archaeology. We're focusing on our work in Long Island, Exuma, and so forth, because these, what we believe, would have been the first locations. We're also getting ready to do an expedition to the Kisal Bank area, because we know in the 1930s an archaeologist found one of those stone celts in the Kisal area. So, well, how did that stone celt get there? Lucayan would have had to, well, not necessarily Lucayan, a boater could have stolen it from somewhere and left it, but who knows, there may be Lucayan sites in Kisal. If we find Lucayan sites in Kisal, that means we're going to have to check Andros, because Andros is hardly being investigated. But one of the things that we're going to also do is recently got a grant from National Geographic to do ancient DNA studies. So we're going to study the DNA of about 30 Lucayan individuals to help us get a better understanding of where their closest genetic match. The best thing about the study is that there are 3 places in the Caribbean that have been selected for this study: the Bahamas, the Mexico area, and Venezuela. So if Lucayans are genetically descended from the original settlers from Venezuela, then the DNA will show it. If they are genetically descended from the settlers from the Mexican area, the DNA will show it. My belief is that the DNA is going to show that it's just a mixing of people, because while maybe they came from Cuba first, we know that there's interaction between Hispaniola, and we know that people marry and exchange, have children, so who knows what the DNA will show us, but it's pretty exciting. So to wrap up, this is what we believe now. It's kind of small, I'm sorry for that. So we believe that these original colonists into the Bahamas left those islands in Cuba and came into the Bahamas. We know, based on how they describe themselves, that they call themselves Lukucari, people of the islands. It's been translated people of the islands, island people, somewhere along there. We don't believe, and I took out a few slides, that the Lucayans were descended from the Taínos. The DNA studies are going to really help us. We know that their settlements were very small, and we believe they moved around quite a bit. This is the original settlers. We believe that they used very little agriculture, and over time it grew. So this agriculture would expand. If any of you ever tried to grow crops on a beach, it's not the best place to do it. And if you lived out on a beach, that may not be the best place to grow stuff. We know that fishing and shell collecting is incredibly important to them. We also now know, and this is something we can say we know, that at least they did some cooking in earth ovens. They did other cooking in hearths. Barbecue, for example, is a word that came from the Caribbean. It's a word that a lot of people would like to say is a Bahamian word for us. We know that pottery, the palmetto is really crappy, but it's rarely used, at least initially, and then it increased over time. There's some communication between Cuba and Hispaniola. And shell beads, cotton, salt, what I didn't talk about, fish, parrots, and so forth, dewhoes were all produced possibly for export, not just for them to consume, but for them to trade with their Caribbean neighbors. I'd like to thank you for your time, and Ms. Major, we have time for questions? Yes, I'll take any questions.
Dr. Pateman, you said that Lucayans may have been nomadic or semi-nomadic based on mainly, you said something about weather patterns?
All right, so when especially the early Lucayan sites, we see that the sites themselves, so normally when archaeologists dig, you expect to find the newest stuff on the top, older stuff on the bottom. The longer somebody was there, the thicker the deposit will be. A lot of these Lucayan sites, the deposit is really thin. So it looks like we were here, we did whatever we had to do, and we left. So we see that here on New Providence, at Clifton, for example. We see that in Long Island, where we're finding these earth ovens, all dating to different time periods along the beach. We've seen it in Crooked Island. San Salvador, not so much, because it seems like San Salvador, I think, is a little different. Through migration, they got to San Salvador and just had nowhere else to go, so they probably stayed there and really expanded. But we see these really thin sites. So it looks like a small group would live here, exploit the area, move over there, exploit the area, move back and forth. But so one of the things we're doing, so in Long Island, we just found a few what they call Kadakia shells. If you cross-section the shell, you can actually get the season it was harvested. So we're hoping that when we cross-section these shells from different spots, that it's the same season. So then it will add to our theory that they only came to this side of the island, or to that site during certain seasons.
And maybe from island to island in different seasons.
Possibly.
Did you find any children's bones?
In Eleuthera, yes. There were, I'm still going through the bones, but there are a couple of juveniles in that cave. And we actually found, so we have the wet cave, and then on the outside there's a little banana hole, and we found originally we didn't know it was two burials because somebody had dug it up for the caver, stuck the bones on the side, we recovered the bones. We knew it was Lucayan because it had a little bit of deformation. Originally thought it was one individual, went back through the bones and found at least one juvenile's bones in it. So it looks like at least two people were buried there. But inside the cave itself, there's a number, I can't remember how many though.
Do you know how big their families were? I mean, did they have more than 4 children, or, you know?
That theory on numbers of people is, I don't subscribe to it. So some archaeologists, especially I think it was Bill Keegan really, had done some studies early on and estimated populations based on number of sites and so forth. But I don't think we have enough data to do that here yet.
So, Mr. Pateman, the Long Island beach burial, I don't remember if you said it. Have they been dated yet?
They have been dated. The dates for those, I think, don't quote me on this, range from between 1000 AD and 1200 AD.